In this video, I'm going to be talking about 9-1, equivalent fractions. Before we can understand what equivalent fractions are, you need to know a couple of terms about fractions in general. The top number in a fraction is called the numerator, and the bottom number is called the denominator. I always think about it like denominators are down. They're on the bottom. The numerator tells you how many pieces you have, and the bottom number, the denominator, tells you the total. So look at this pizza. Let's pretend it's a pizza. It's cut into 4 pieces. So the total goes on the bottom, and the part that you have goes up top. So we have a total of 4 pieces, and let's say I ate one of those pieces. The part that I ate is 1 out of 4 pieces. So we would read this fraction as 1/4 or 1 out of 4. The word equivalent is a fancy way of saying equal. So equivalent fractions are fractions that are equal to each other or that have the same value to one another. So for example, if these 2 circles are pizzas, let's say, I could say that I have 1/2 of a pizza. I could also take that same pizza and split it into 4 pieces, and now that same area that was 1/2 becomes 2 out of my 4 pieces, 2/4. That means that those 2, since they have the same value or cover the same amount of the pizza, are equivalent fractions. They're equal to one another. Similarly, I could say that this pizza on the right, let's say I ate 1/4 of it. I have 4 pieces here, and one of them is eaten. So if you look at the purple, it looks like 1/4. But if you look at the blue, it looks like 2 out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pieces are shaded in. So that means 1/4 and 2/8 are equivalent. Now we could draw pictures for every problem to find equivalent fractions, but that might get a little bit time-consuming and tedious. So there's a quicker and easier way to use mathematical calculations to find equivalent fractions. What you can do is multiply the top and the bottom of the fraction, the numerator and denominator, by the same number. That will give you an equivalent fraction. So 10/15 is equivalent to 20/30. Why does this work? Well, what you're really doing is multiplying by 2/2. If we look at a picture, 2/2 is the same thing as 1 whole. Anything times 1 is itself. Think about it. 8 times 1 is 8, or 10 times 1 is 10. The identity property tells us that anything times 1 is itself. So when I multiply the top and the bottom by the same thing, I'm really multiplying by 1. So I end up with something that looks different, but because I multiplied by 1, it has the same value. You can also make equivalent fractions by dividing the top and the bottom by the same number. With this fraction, 7 out of 21, I see that they both have a factor in common, which is 7. So if I divided the top by 7 and the bottom by 7, 7 divided by 7 is 1, and 21 divided by 7 is 3. So I would get 1/3. This means that 7/21 and 1/3 are equivalent. This works because when I divide by the same thing on the top and the bottom, I'm dividing by 1. Think about it. I divided by 7/7. 7/7 is 1 whole. Whenever I divide something by 1, I get the same number I started with. 8 divided by 1 is 1. 100 divided by 1 is 100, so on and so forth. So to recap, we can make equivalent fractions by multiplying the top number and the bottom number, the numerator and denominator, by the same thing, or by dividing the numerator and denominator by the same number, if they have a factor in common. So if I had something like 1/2, I could multiply the top and the bottom number by anything as long as it's the same number to get an equivalent fraction. I could multiply them by 100 or 1,000 or even 1,000,000. 100 over 200 is the same as 1 over 2. 1 million over 2 million is the same thing as 1/2. Because all I would do is multiply the top by a million and the bottom by a million. I could also do the same thing with division. If I have, let's say, 100 out of 150, and I notice that they have a factor in common, in this case 50, I can divide the top and the bottom by the same thing because I'm really dividing by 1. So 100 over 150 is the same thing as 2/3. Now you try. On your sheet of paper, you need to write two fractions that are equivalent to 4/5. Think if you can use multiplication or division. You might be able to use both or just one or the other. Write at least two fractions that are equivalent to 4/5 and bring it with you tomorrow. Good luck!